Well, congratulations, all three of you, on wonderful presentations. You get plenty of congratulations and reaffirmation in your career, so yours was great too. Excellent job. Well done. It's so interesting. Thank you. Round of applause. Katja, you made a statement that I thought was interesting when you said there's a nostalgia in every age. I mean, Stuart started by talking about the origins of the idea of nostalgia, something that's been with us now for half a millennium, or 5 millennia, excuse me, half of whatever that is. It's been with us for as a concept going on for so long, and it has evolved, as Stuart said, from something that was an illness to a psychological condition of dislocation to a marketing strategy. And yet, all of you presented nostalgia in interesting ways. It didn't always mean the same thing. And for instance, I found that the commercial that you showed, that ad wasn't so much about nostalgia unless you called it a nostalgia for nature. Just what you were talking about when you talked about what's pastoral. As if the minute industry comes in, it's something that is post, it has to be, then nature has to be nostalgic only because it isn't always existing everywhere in the world. So my question after this very long preamble to you, all of you, is what makes today's nostalgia different from the nostalgia of the past? Not the long past that you were talking about, say mid-20th century, but say the nostalgia of the 50s when Leave It to Beaver and the Saturday Evening Post were far more active.
I mean, for the nostalgia for Main Street in contemporary politics, I think the situation is far more dire than it was back in the 50s. I think that's used more insidiously to persuade populations to behave in ways that are against their best interest. For example, supporting a wrong war. I think that's really used in a very, with mass media and that type of being able to get around to so many people. That wonderful image, that lovely American image, it's like, let's go fight. I think this is just far more dangerous now than it was.
Well, I think relating to my research, how nostalgia is different today relates to how this longing for the past is so disconnected, both in terms of the idea and also just in terms of such a long span of time that, we are nostalgic for things, for the pastoral from the 1920s when, no one actually remembers any of it. And I also think that that our nostalgia now has this thoroughly contemporary cast where we want the past, but with none of the baggage and with none of the inconvenience. So we want the idea of our food to be healthy. We want, the idea that it was just picked from the ground, but no one actually wants to take, to have the inconvenience of actually having to do that themselves.
In my case, I'm thinking of the 50s, for example, to compare. I mean, unless you're looking at Etsy, who is trying to make us think that we are living in an Eames era if we own the chair, I think that the nostalgia of that era's modernism was much more hopeful and future-looking, where the materials that were used for furniture, for example, were mass-produced, were affordable, and were made with good quality, everything, really. Now we have the cheap version of that. We have the MDF board that has toxic fumes coming out of it. So I think we have this knockoff of that modernism. And I don't mean the strictures of modernism. I mean the utopic qualities of modernism are the ones that are missing today.
Well, somebody can correct me about this, but my understanding of the Eames's attempts were that those chairs were actually very expensive and they really couldn't bring the prices down to the extent that they would have wanted to. So that even that was a kind of nostalgic fantasy about democracy that, I mean,
well, that was nostalgia for the future.
Nostalgia for the future, when you could actually have everything.
I mean, one of the things, is this thing on? Okay. First of all, one of the things that's interesting, and it hasn't come up yet today, it's not on. One of the things that is interesting, and I think hasn't been mentioned yet today, is the difference between nostalgia and memory. Because memory is this essential tool for knowing where we come from. Take it off?
Just talking in this direction. It's
What?
good. It's good.
It's good? I should talk like this? The box?
Use this one.
Yeah, this is fine. And that is that, memory is part of knowing where we come from, knowing where things come from. It's about history, having a sense of living in a world which didn't come out of nowhere. I think that the problem with nostalgia, particularly as we've been talking about it today, is that aside from the case of that woman, Chloe? No, the woman you were describing. Oh, Brooke. Yes, Brooke. Who is the woman who lives in Harlem? Oh, that's Brooke. Okay, that's Brooke. I mean, she is building her environment around her memory of her parents' and grandparents' environment. But I mean, I think that generally speaking, the sense of nostalgia is completely dissociated from memory and dissociated from history. And in certain ways, it becomes a kind of ersatz memory in a world where there is epidemic amnesia. So it's like having a memory and also having a culture which, consumes each day and wipes out all forms of meaningful memory.
Yeah, I think as far as the demographic that I described, I think hipsterism is a perfect example of that, because hipster, it's a term that's hard to define, but basically it's an amalgamation of all pasts, all the cool pasts. Like you have the 20s flapper and the beatniks and the hippies all in one. So really, you don't have to live at any kind of time. Hipsterism doesn't ever have to end. It's the perpetual then, perpetual now, every single day. So who needs memory when you have all the paraphernalia? Devil's advocate, guys.
Katya, can you say that paraphernalia really has substance? Are the hipsters really trying to take a piece of the past, or are they just assimilating something they think is cool and it's just not required anymore to be inventive and come up with something out of whole cloth?
Well, that's the danger, I think, is that it will stop and stall invention. Is that if you think you could just borrow from the past and think that's already contemporary, then that's, I think, where critics can come in to realize that there are actually roots to these things and sources that people need to be aware of.
Is there any truth to nostalgia? I mean, couldn't things really have been better in the past?
Well, I'll have the microphone, so I'll answer.
Do you want to go back to the last question?
No,
Just
for
put that one in.
No, and actually I'm glad, because this is something that I discussed in my research but didn't get to touch on in my presentation, is that obviously the industrialization of food has done so much good in a way that it's, with problems of food shortages. So that problem of the past, where there was a genuine concern about not being able to feed every single person in the world, so the industrialization has its benefits, so that in a way, the past wasn't as perfect as people imagine, but I think that this industrialization has been taken to such an extreme with the drive for profits that people imagine that the past was better than it even was in terms of food.
Okay, after you and then Stuart.
Okay, sorry. So I think that the nostalgia for the old main streets, what is lost is the community that used to, before this, pre-car culture, what's lost is the community that happened on those streets. But when we think about those communities, we tend to forget to take a deeper look at what those communities looked like. Those communities were also very white, very segregated, very, women stayed at home. So, yeah, there was community, but only for some people.
I think the idea of deciding whether the past was better or worse is kind of the binary thinking that has been critiqued in Katya's presentation. There are things about, first of all, the pastoral stuff. The United States has been defined by commercialized agriculture since the Civil War. The family farm was being wiped out since the time of the Civil War, when you had the development of, initially in the meat packing industries, Armour and Swift, and you know, certainly by the 1920s and 30s, rural poverty in the United States and the old farm, you know, was a goner. There were holdouts. When I was a student at the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s, there were these members of the National Farmers Organization, the NFO, and you'd go through the countryside and you'd see barns with the letters NFO on them. And these people were shooting at Borden's milk trucks, okay? So there were people who were trying to hold on to local family farms. They just weren't there. So, I mean, I think a lot of even the memory of a recent past is a fabricated memory. The real issue, I think, in terms of nostalgia is not whether or not, I mean, yes, industrialization of food has made the possibility of all people being well-fed exist. Well, all people are not well-fed. Why? Because while people, for example, like Marx and anarchists and other socialists in the 19th century saw the industrial system as something that was capable of providing for all people's needs, the economic organization of that system was not organized in order to meet people's needs. And so you have, I mean, today it's about the 1% and the 99. So industrialism offered promise to a lot of people, but it's not a promise that has been delivered. In fact, it's delivering less and less. The thing that's important about the past is not that it was people's lives were defined by material well-being, but that there was an interconnectedness and an interdependency that was part of life, where people were able to rely on one another in certain circumstances, where they lived in a world of familiars which wasn't defined so much by commodities, but more by social relations. I think that's something which modernity threw the baby out with the bathwater when it came to that.
No, okay. Question.
Oh, well, I was just wanted to follow up on what you just said, Stuart. The atomization that occurred through modernity. We're now at a time when urban centers are growing, and we're looking at what looks like the rural sadness that's happening in a small town. What you've described with the meth epidemic, in a way, it's an urban problem has now moved out into the small town, and now we have the concentration and potential sense of community in the urban centers. Do you think that there's some repair for those social relationships, and how do you think that will affect our feeling about, or affect the nostalgia, whatever you want to call it, an epidemic? Perpetual illness.
I don't think that the rebirth of the cities is necessarily a rebirth of community. I think usually communities happen in times of crisis, when the schools are getting gutted. Like, for example, my grandson's school in Brooklyn is under attack by the mayor and the centralized control of the school system. All of a sudden, people are brought together to defend themselves. People are brought together when foreclosures and the loss of the American dream are becoming epidemic. Death brings people together, and illness brings people together. But I don't think that these environments are necessarily conducive to community because people live in large buildings and they don't know their neighbors.
Everybody agree with that? Does anybody see any hope for urbanism or anything else restoring a sense of community? You can argue with him.
I don't feel hopeless.
Oh, okay.
I just don't view external environments as the fountain of hope. I think the fountain of hope is people getting together and sort of breaking from the atomization. And I think that's one of the things that's been really exciting about the Occupy movement, with all of the fact that in today's New York Times, the story about the Occupy movement was smaller than almost any other story in the paper. I mean, there will be attempts. There will be I mean, there is an attempt to kind of make this thing invisible. And there are also laws that have been passed in recent times which make people assembling anywhere near meetings of people in power a crime. So we're seeing like an evisceration of the First Amendment while everybody's off defending the Second Amendment. So this is it's not going to be easily won, because even our friend Obama, who was a nostalgic repository of hope, the evisceration of civil liberties in the last 4 years has been quite significant, and including these laws, which are basically anti-Occupy laws, laws which are designed to make public assembly, particularly if it's challenging vested wealth, illegal.
Well, yesterday when people gathered for the strike day at Union Square, I was reminded where I see hope and positivity coming from nostalgia was the reemergence of farmers markets, like in Union Square, like the strike was held yesterday, and also community gardens. So I think that there is a positive element to nostalgia when it translates into actual action, as opposed to symbolism. Because farmers markets have been hugely successful, community gardens have been hugely successful, but they were quickly co-opted, and their symbolism was co-opted, and placed on food packaging as a comfort method. However, there is still a huge community of people that were nostalgic and had a longing for a past and translated that into something real.
Brief remarks from you, and you, if you have final remarks to make.
Oh, so, okay.
Sorry.
No, I think I'll end with this idea of what could be good from nostalgia. I think in speaking of what I was mentioning before, for example, the furniture market, if I'm going to stick with my topic, the return of artisan, handcrafted work, the fact that big retail stores are understanding that that's actually an important product. We saw it today with the examples that I show. West Elm has a person that they hired to make limited edition tables and chairs, and people buy that stuff because there's a connection. I just think that this isn't DIY. This isn't about amateurism. This is about a return to craft. And I think it's very welcome. And so I think more to that. The only problem is that there has to be a new business model invented for that, because craftspeople and masters can no longer be treated as vendors, which is the way they're treated in China.
I think the use of people, there is a resurgence of the revitalization of small town downtowns. It's a far better thing to have that happen when it can happen, rather than let them become disused, or the greenfield developments of the new urbanists who create these really fake main streets that are far more like Disney than they are like real places. So I do think that that if it's nostalgia that motivates people to save their downtowns, fine with me.
Well, let us end on that positive note. Thank you so much, panelists, and we'll now take a break, and I will let you be back in 20 minutes.